Lakshman, please feel free to directly share screen and give the talk on, is MEV a problem to be solved or a reality to live with? Will you be able to share screen? If you have trouble, I can share it for you.
Sorry, 1 second. Yeah, I'm having some, I should have tested this earlier, but I'm having some like accessibility issues. 1 second. Cool. Do you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Excellent.
You may want to, yeah, perfect.
All right. So hi everyone. My talk is MEV a problem to be solved or reality to be lived with? I think it's pretty clear that this is a rhetorical question, and the answer is sort of both. The truth is more nuanced, as Hasu pointed out at the end of his presentation just before. In some sense, we need to be working to both democratize MEV extraction and mitigate within protocol and application where it makes sense. And so really, I guess my talk is sort of a further argument that this is the case, that there is nuance here, as well as a few thoughts around how I'm thinking about how the future here will play out. Because it is also interesting to think about where will naturally MEV mitigation come into play, like what types of chains, and where will democratization be inevitable. So by way of quick introduction, I work as a researcher with the Ethereum Foundation on a bunch of different stuff. I think if I had to classify what research questions I end up involved with, it's stuff at the kind of boundaries of our protocols and where things are changing. So things like layer 2s, MEV, ETH2, staking pools, and other things as well. And so this is kind of like, I guess, the why of the talk. I think MEV is an old topic in the sense that it's been on people's radar since the early days of Ethereum, but it's newly something that everyone kind of cares about. And as a result of that, I think there's naturally been this sort of bipartisan split in talking about it. And as an American, I can kind of speak to the fact that sometimes leads to an aversion of truth. And it feels like both of these two parties that have been propped up in these two sets of beliefs that I've sort of kind of like put up here are sort of missing the nuance, or at least some nuance will get missed if you just read what these two groups are kind of putting out as truth. And so kind of what I see the evidence that the future will be more nuanced. I think there are three things that really come to mind. So one is, and this has been talked about elsewhere, but there's sort of a limit to scalability on a single synchronous block space. Actually, Vitalik wrote a good blog post about this that maybe I should have linked, but and as a result, if we're thinking about what the world looks like when all finance, or all of some superset of finance exists on chain, we're going to have synchronous block spaces communicating asynchronously. So we're going to have a multi-chain world. There's going to be difference in choices in different places, and there's going to be MEV to be captured between domains. Additionally, it's interesting that to observe that chains that exist today that seem to be serving the same sort of market in big quotes here are making different choices with respect to MEV. I think the example a lot of people think about is Optimism kind of like really championing MEV auctions, and Arbitrum kind of pursuing fair sequencing, fair ordering. So maybe that's evidence that like that seems like pretty direct evidence that we're going to have multiple choices out in the wild. And then finally, I think this is an area that needs more research and more formalism. And I'll suggest some thoughts on this a little later. But intersynchronous block space MEV is quite different from intra-synchronous block space MEV in terms of what is possible and how kind of big it is. And there are a bunch of different ramifications of that I think we'll figure out in the years to come. So yeah, so two factors I kind of think about when I'm thinking about what is the future of how chains organize with respect to MEV. As I mentioned earlier, I think the inter versus intra-chain MEV question is really interesting and sort of underexplored. And then finally, there's a bunch of trade-offs, engineering and security-wise, when it comes to many of the mitigation techniques people are exploring. And so it's reasonable to think that different chains will make different choices there. So yeah, this is a kind of interesting topic. So like we haven't, first of all, like so inter-chain MEV, it's worth sort of talking about what that is. So let's say you run, there's a few different regimes. There's like say a couple L2s and maybe like side chains, and you are running the proposer or validator, whatever the thing is that has sort of a monopoly on transaction sequencing on multiple of these chains. Then you might be able to capture kind of opportunities that exist between these chains. But one thing that's very different about a synchronous block space and things across synchronous block spaces is that there is a time delay. There's always some time delay between two blocks occurring in two different systems. And as a result of that, there always is some period of time where an outside party with a large amount of money can observe you putting something in a block in chain A and intervene in chain B. This is not true for intra-chain MEV, and I feel like this means that intra-chain MEV is considerably scarier, like intra-synchronous block space MEV. It seems like there are much deeper things that can happen there, but it's also kind of like reassuring because as I'll get to later, within a single chain, it feels like many things can be mitigated if the chain chooses to do so. And then yeah, like I think Phil's talked about this at length, but basically between many different chains, it's inevitable that there will be kind of these MEV opportunities between different chains because there's no universal notion of fairness. As I'll also talk about later, like that with regards to sort of like the cryptographic and like privacy oriented mitigation techniques, there are trade-offs there that make me believe that not every chain will choose to adopt, like, say, the best technique there. Cool. Yeah, and so yeah, the other piece of this puzzle is that like all of the mitigation techniques, seem to introduce trade-offs that it's not obvious that every single regime will want to choose. And this is sort of evidenced by my point about optimism and arbitrum earlier. But yeah, like anything involving time lock encryption introduces some type of latency into the use of into the use of your system. Anything using some kind of fair sequencing or like a threshold encryption thing adds some security assumption to how the chain works. And so it's just not obvious to me that there's like a universal best solution here, or it's even possible that there will be one. Yeah, and so this is kind of this is sort of like if there is a conclusion of this talk, this is sort of like what I think is true, and it's sort of self-evident, but it's worth restating over and over until it's kind of common lexicon if it's true, and it's that like interchain MEV is inevitable. It's probably not as bad as intra-chain, but it's something that we should work to kind of like democratize. Intra-chain is going to exist. But MEV mitigation research will mitigate some of this. I doubt it'll mitigate all of it. There will be like kind of there's heterogeneous choices that'll be made here. And yeah, and so that's the conclusion. Mitigate where we can and democratize elsewhere. Hasu made this point as well, and I will echo it. And that's all I got.